The Shadows Beneath, a Haunting Legacy. 1. The House. It started with a house, a small, unassuming bungalow on the outskirts of a quiet town in Indiana. It wasn't much, but for me, a newly divorced dad of one, it was everything I could afford. The plan was simple: start over. A fresh start for me and my daughter, Sophie, who had just turned 6. The house had been sitting on the market for months. The real estate agent brushed it off as a lack of interest due to the location. But when I asked around, the neighbors were less dismissive. One older man, who lived 2 doors down, warned me, "That house has a history." I laughed it off. History didn't scare me, but I should have listened. The basement. The first time I noticed something odd was during move-in day. While unpacking, Sophie wandered off, as kids often do, and I found her in the basement. She was standing in the far corner, staring at the wall. The basement was dark and damp, the air thick with mildew. "Sophie, what are you doing down here?" I asked, flipping on the single overhead bulb. The light cast eerie shadows on the concrete walls. She turned to me with a blank expression. "The man says he doesn't like it when we're noisy." I froze. "What man?" She pointed to the wall. "Him." There was nothing there, just cracked paint and an old water stain that vaguely resembled a face. I shook it off as Sophie's overactive imagination and led her upstairs. But that night, I couldn't sleep. 3. The noises. The first week in the house was relatively uneventful. Sophie seemed happy, and I was slowly getting used to the new routine. But then the noises started. It began with faint tapping at night. At first I thought it was the old pipes or maybe mice in the walls. But the tapping became more rhythmic, almost deliberate. It always seemed to come from the basement. One night I decided to investigate. Armed with a flashlight, I crept down the creaky stairs. The basement was silent, save for the hum of the furnace. I shone the flashlight around, but nothing seemed out of place. As I turned to go back upstairs, I heard it. 3 deliberate knocks on the wall. I spun around, shining the light toward the sound, but the wall was bare. My heart raced as I climbed the stairs 2 at a time. 4. Sophie's friend. "His name is Mr. Owen," Sophie announced at breakfast a few days later. I looked up from my coffee. "Who?" "The man in the basement," she said matter-of-factly. "He doesn't like you, Daddy. He says you're too loud." I felt a chill run down my spine. "Sophie, there's no man in the basement. You know that, right?" She shrugged and went back to her cereal. But that night, I found her sitting on the basement stairs, whispering. "Sophie, come to bed," I said firmly. She looked up at me, her eyes wide. "I was just telling Mr. Owen good night. He's lonely, Daddy." 5. The history. The next day, I decided to dig into the house's history. A quick online search revealed that the house had been owned by a man named George Owen in the 1970s. According to old newspaper articles, George was a recluse who rarely left the house. He was suspected of murdering a local teenager who went missing in 1978, but there wasn't enough evidence to convict him. George died in the house a few years later, and it had been sold multiple times since then, each owner staying only a short while. I tried to dismiss it as a coincidence, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. 6. The handprint. That night, I dreamt of the basement. In the dream, I was standing in the same corner Sophie had pointed to, staring at the wall. Slowly, a handprint began to appear on the concrete, pressing outward as if someone was trapped on the other side. I woke up drenched in sweat, but the nightmare was far from over. When I went downstairs the next morning, I found a small, dusty handprint on the basement wall. The same spot from my dream. It was too small to be mine and too large to be Sophie's. 7. Sophie's behavior. Over the next few weeks, Sophie's behavior changed. She became withdrawn, spending hours in her room drawing strange pictures. One day I found a crayon drawing of a tall man with hollow eyes standing in the basement. Next to him was a little girl holding his hand. "Who's this?" I asked, holding up the picture. "It's me and Mr. Owen," she said simply. I decided it was time to call in help. 8. The medium a friend of mine recommended a local medium, a woman named Clara who specialized in clearing out unwanted energies. I was skeptical but desperate. Clara arrived with a bundle of sage and a serious expression. As soon as she stepped into the house, her face tightened. "There's something very wrong here," she said. She walked through the house, stopping in the basement. "This is where he is," she said, pointing to the same corner Sophie had. "He's attached to this place, to the wall." "Can you get rid of him?" I asked. Clara nodded. "I can try." 9. The cleansing Clara performed a cleansing ritual that evening. She lit the sage and walked through the house, chanting softly. When she reached the basement, the temperature seemed to drop. Sophie clung to my leg as Clara stood in the corner, her voice rising. Suddenly, the overhead bulb shattered, plunging us into darkness. Sophie screamed, and I grabbed her, bolting up the stairs. Clara followed, her face pale. "He's strong," she said. "I've never felt anything like this." 10. The final night. That night, the house felt heavier than ever. Sophie slept in my bed, and I lay awake, listening to the sounds of the house settling. Around 3 a.m., I heard it, the rhythmic tapping from the basement, louder than ever. I grabbed a flashlight and crept downstairs, determined to end this once and for all. The tapping grew louder as I approached the corner. My hands trembled as I shone the light on the wall. There, in the concrete, was the faint outline of a face. Hollow eyes stared back at me, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. Suddenly, the flashlight flickered, and the tapping stopped. The air grew still, and a voice whispered in my ear, "Leave." I didn't hesitate. I grabbed Sophie and left the house that night, never to return. 11. The return months after leaving, I found myself standing in front of the house again. Clara had called me, saying she felt something unfinished. Together, we brought a priest for help. The house was empty, yet the air inside felt suffocating. The basement walls seemed to breathe as we descended. 12. The revelation. During the priest's prayers, a crack appeared in the basement wall. Clara screamed as shadows moved unnaturally. Hidden inside the wall was a child's skeletal remains. Clara explained, "This is why he lingers. The past traps him." 13. The showdown. As prayers intensified, a black figure emerged, tall and featureless. It wailed, throwing objects across the room. The priest demanded its release. Clara scattered salt, shouting chants. The figure shrieked as it dissolved into the floor. 14. Closure. The child's remains were buried, and the priest blessed the ground. Sophie's nightmares stopped, but I felt lingering unease. Clara assured me, "He's gone, but scars like these never fade." 15 years later, I passed by the property. It was replaced with a park, yet an odd silence surrounded it. On the swings, I saw a small shadowy figure, only visible for a moment before vanishing. 16. Final message. One last time I dreamed of the basement. The walls whispered, "Thank you," as light poured into the space. I woke up knowing we had freed something, and perhaps ourselves too. 17. A lingering shadow. But freedom is never permanent. A few months after my dream, I began hearing faint knocks on my apartment walls. At first I thought it was the neighbors, but late one night Sophie came into my room. Her voice trembled. "Daddy, Mr. Owen says he misses us." 18. A new haunting. The knocks turned into whispers. Sophie started drawing again. Familiar hollow eyes, dark corners, and shadows. Clara came to visit, but this time she looked exhausted. "You might have taken part of him with you," she confessed. 19. Sophie's plea. One night, Sophie begged me to return to the park where the house had been. "He won't leave us alone until we go back," she insisted. Clara agreed. Spirits tied to pain rarely stay buried. The three of us set out under a pale moonlight. 20. The confrontation. At the park, Sophie led us to the swings where I had seen the shadow. Clara began chanting while sprinkling salt and sage. Suddenly, the air grew cold, and the shadow materialized, larger and more menacing than before. Sophie stepped forward, unafraid, and whispered, "You're free now." For the first time, the shadow hesitated, then faded into the night. 21st. Final goodbye. That night, Sophie slept peacefully for the first time in months. I watched her, relieved. Clara assured me, "It's over now. He's finally at rest. 22. The park's secret. The next morning, we found a plaque at the park's entrance, in memory of the missing. A chill ran down my spine. I asked around, but no one seemed to know who had installed it or when. 23. A new beginning. Though life returned to normal, I sometimes catch Sophie staring into empty corners with a knowing look. He's not here anymore, she always says. But her voice is calm, almost certain. And yet, every so often, I hear a faint tap in the silence of the night. 24. Sophie's vision. Years later, Sophie shared something that chilled me to my core. She said she often dreams of a dark room where Mr. Owen stands, not as a shadow, but as a man. He's not angry anymore, she explained. He just watches, as if waiting for something. 25. The unending cycle. One night, while unpacking boxes in our new home, I heard a faint knock. I froze, heart pounding, as Sophie entered the room. "Daddy," she said softly, "it's okay. He's not here to hurt us anymore. He's just there." And in the stillness, I realized some stories never truly end. They simply wait for their next chapter.